It is so special to have this much love and support. You know, I've been traveling around the country as a kind of second job since October the 7th, talking about the history of the Jewish people in the state of Israel. In fact, I met Mark Motley in Kentucky speaking on that subject, the same subject I'm going to speak about here today. And I come home and my mother asks me, she says, "What do they think of us in Kentucky?" And I said, "Ma, well, they're very divided in Kentucky." She said, "Oh, even in Kentucky they're divided." And I said, "Look, good news is that 50% of them think Hamas is the worst thing in the world." And she said, "Only 50%?" And I said, "The other 50% think it's the Columbia University protesters." In March and April, at our Passover Seder, we sang the ancient Jewish hymn, Avadim Hayenu. We were slaves in Egypt, just as our ancestors have done for thousands of years. And when the song was done, my sons, Gideon and Aaron, came to me and said, "Papa, my teacher tells us that we aren't slaves anymore, that we're now a free people in our own land." And I had to bite my tongue because I knew what those boys did not know, which is that this year we are not all free. That this year 115 of us, Jewish men and women, Jewish boys and girls, are being held, even as we sit here today, in deep, dark, dank holes, hundreds of feet beneath the earth, surveilled by real-life monsters. And 6 of them, my friends, are American citizens, and we don't even know their names. We never speak their names. We never hear their names on our television broadcasts. We never read their names on the pages of our newspapers. Ask yourselves, why? In March, 14 federal judges from around the country, one of whom, Judge Solemson, is here today, took a first-ever judicial education mission to Israel. Half were Jewish, half were Christian. We watched the 47-minute video of Hamas atrocities, a barbarism, a mutilation, a slaughter of innocent Jews like you could never in your darkest nightmares begin to conjure, set against the backdrop of jubilation, of high-fiving, of cackling, of repeated refrain. Not free Palestine, we never heard that. Of Allahu Akbar, over and over and over again. When it was all said and done, more than 1,200 people lay dead, beheaded, mutilated, burned alive in front of their families. And yet, on the campuses of my alma maters, at universities all across this country, we Jews are the aggressors. They raped hundreds of women and girls. And yet, in Western media outlets, we Jews are the oppressors. They took more than 250 of us hostage and held them in holes for 100, 200, now 297 days. And yet, at the United Nations, we Jews are the violators of human rights. The moral confusion, the moral vulnerability, the moral perversion is almost too pathetic for words. Where does it come from? It comes from a series of lies that have been told about Jews and the one Jewish state in the world. Some of you have told me that you've seen my speeches in the last 9 months. You know that I talk about 6 big lies, but I only have time for 3 of them, and I've been told that if I go over my time, I'm going to be yanked off this stage. So I'm only going to tell you about 3 of them. The first big lie, the lie that has swept academia, is the most preposterous lie of all, that Jews are colonists in the land of Israel. Folks, you know that Jews have lived and ruled in the land of Israel for thousands of years because you know your Bible. But in the 19th century and early 20th century, it was common to say that the Bible was just a story. Folks, what you probably also know, but which they do not know on the college campuses across this country, is that in the last 100 years, archaeology has proven the Jewish pedigree in the land. The first mention of Jews outside the Bible in the archaeological record comes from the year 1205 BC. That's more than 3,200 years ago. Merneptah was the son of Ramses II, the great builder of ancient Egypt. And when Ramses died, Merneptah became emperor. And he composed a stele. It's a giant basalt tablet made of rock. It's about 10 feet high and 12 inches thick. It looks like the tablets that Moses would have brought down from Sinai if Moses was carrying a 10,000-pound stone. Nowadays, people like to say it's Zionist propaganda, but it was found in the 19th century by a German archaeologist, and it's being housed in the Cairo Museum. And on Merneptah's stele, 3,200 years ago, Merneptah writes about all his military accomplishments. And at the very bottom of Merneptah's stele, Merneptah's scribes write that he brought his Egyptian army into, not Palestine, no such thing existed, into Israel. And he fought the king of Israel in battle right at places like Ashkelon and Gezer, 2 cities that are still in the land of Israel today. And it's not just Egypt. If you go all around the periphery of the modern state of Israel, you'll find similar archaeological finds over the last 100 years. In what's now Jordan, the people who used to live there, you'll remember from the Bible, they were the Moabites. And the Moabites had a king named Mesha. And Mesha also wrote a stele in the 840s BC. And Mesha's stele says that he went to war against the house of Israel. And he said something amazing. He said that he went to war against the men of God, G-A-D. You'll remember from your Bible, God was one of the 12 sons of Jacob, one of the original 12 tribes of Israel. He says he went to war on the other side of the river, the Jordan River, in what's now Judea and Samaria, against the tribe of God who lived there. And he says in 840 BC, those men, the men of God, have lived in that land, the land of Israel, since ancient times. Even in the 840s BC, it was clear to the people who lived in what we now know as Jordan, that Jews had lived and ruled in the land of Israel since ancient times. Just to put context, folks, Muhammad isn't born until 570 AD. Islam isn't a thing in the world until 620 AD. That means that Jews had been living and ruling in the land of Israel, according to the archaeological record, for thousands of years before Islam was even a thing in the Middle East. Fast forward, I want to tell you about the year 132 AD. The Jews were living under Roman rule, and they were not happy. The Romans had forbidden the practice of circumcision. They had expelled them from Jerusalem, the holy city that King David had built. And they revolted. This revolt came from the north. The revolutionary was named Simon Bar Kokhba, Simon, son of the star. And they sloughed off Roman rule for 3 years, and they issued their own currency. Folks, you can go to the Israel Museum and see these coins. There are thousands of them. Actually, when we, the judges, were in Israel, I asked to touch them. And they said, "You're not allowed to touch them, Judge." I was upset, but I still took a photo. On the front part of the coin is the facade of the Second Temple. The same Second Temple the Jews had built in 538 BC, when Cyrus II, the Persian king of kings, had sent them back from exile into Jerusalem and told them to rebuild their temple. Above the facade of the Second Temple is the Magen David, the Jewish Star of David, which still adorns the center of the flag of the Jewish state of Israel, an unbelievable connection to our past, and don't ever forget it. But that's not all. On the back side of the coin, on Bar Kokhba's coins from 2,000 years ago, around a lulav. The lulav is the plant that we Jews shake on the holiday of Sukkot to commemorate our exodus from Egypt 3,000 years ago. Around a lulav is written, not in Polish. Remember the college professors at Columbia, they say we came from Poland and Belarus and Brooklyn, I guess, in the 20th century. It's not in Polish, it's not in Belarusian, it's not in English from Brooklyn. In crisp, clear Hebrew letters are written the words, Year One for the redemption of Israel. Year One for the redemption of Israel. And that's why in 1948, fast forward 2,000 years, when it came time to decide what will we call this redeemed and reconstituted Jewish state in the land of Israel, that the committee headed by Ben-Gurion voted 6-3, let's call it Israel, because that was year one in the redemption and reconstitution of a land and a kingdom and a people that had lived and existed in that land for thousands of years, even at that early date. The land of Israel was, and I'm going to use this word for the first time, then occupied by foreign forces. First the Romans, then the Byzantines. Then we get our first occupying Arab armies who come in the 630s, the Rashidans. Arabs are not from Israel, folks. They're from Arabia. And the Rashidans are descendants of Muhammad. They come to Israel, they conquer, they stay, and then they lose it to the Umayyads from Damascus, another occupying force. And the Umayyads lose it to the Abbasids from Baghdad. And the Abbasids lose it to the Fatimids from Egypt. And the Fatimids lose it to the Seljuks from Turkey. And then the Crusaders come, and they're there for a couple hundred years. And they lose it to Saladin's forces, also from Egypt, who then loses it to their own slave warriors, a slave army from Egypt called the Mamluks, who were there until an overwhelming foreign empire takes over all of the Middle East, including the land of Israel, in 1517. And that, of course, is the Ottomans. And the Ottomans rule Israel, including the Jewish people in the land, as foreign occupying colonists for 400 years, until the land is liberated in 1918 by the British. And finally, 30 years after that, as I mentioned, we get the redemption of the Jewish state of Israel. Folks, if you go back 3,000 years ago to Merneptah Stele, and you analyze all the different people who existed in the world at that time, there is only one people who still speaks the same language, practices the same religion, and lives and rules in the same land as they did 3,000 years ago, and those are the Jews who live in the modern state of Israel. If we care about the rights of indigenous people, there are no more indigenous people on the face of the earth than the Jews who live and rule in Israel, and you don't have to take my word for it. You don't have to take my word for it. Because in March of 1918, when the Ottoman threat was taken out, King Hussein, the king of all the Arabs, remember at that time there was no such thing as Iraq and Lebanon and Syria and Jordan. Those are all inventions of a colonialist period. Back then there was just the king of all the Arabs, King Hussein. It's his son Prince Faisal, you may have seen him, along with Peter O'Toole, I mean T.E. Lawrence, who sloughed off Ottoman rule in 1917. That's his son. In March of 1918, King Hussein, the leader of all the Arabs, writes an op-ed, not in the Wall Street Journal, in the Al-Qibla Daily News, the Mecca Daily News. And he says, if we want the British and French powers to take our claims to our ancestral land seriously, by which he meant Mesopotamia, Iraq, of course the Arabian Peninsula, then we cannot deny the ancestral claim of the Jewish people to their ancient homeland. And he ended the article by saying, and I quote, "They, the Jews, are the original sons of that land, the land of Israel." Nine months later, his son, Prince Faisal, who you saw fighting in Lawrence of Arabia alongside Peter O'Toole, Prince Faisal, who would become the first king of Iraq, King Faisal, he has a banquet in his honor in Jerusalem. And at the end of the banquet, he turns to his friend, Lord Rothschild, the Jewish man, December of 1918. And he says, "We recognize the Jewish claim to this land, your ancestral homeland." And he ends by saying, "To my Zionist friends, welcome home." And yet we Jews are called settlers, colonists, and occupiers in our own land. Ask yourselves why. The second big lie I want to talk to you about today is that what happened in 1948 was illegitimate and aberrational. Folks, nothing could be further from the truth. There are three main ways in which a nation, a people can become a state. You can win it in a war, and there are two kinds of wars: offensive wars, not that legitimate, and defensive wars, legitimate. You can have a long presence in the land, well established, and you can have a legal deed that says, I have a right to this land, much as you would in your home. Let's compare it to a country we all, I hope, agree is legitimate, the United States. We won it in a war, 1775 to 1783, but it was an offensive war. George III didn't want that war. In fact, when John Adams goes as the first minister to England, what does King George say? I was, quote, the last to agree to the separation. He didn't want that war. We started that war, we won that war. Are we legitimate sovereigns over our land? Of course we are. Second prong, we came in 1607 to Jamestown, but we came as Englishmen and women. We really didn't think of ourselves as different than Englishmen and women until a trial in Boston in 1761. A trial where James Otis, an early leader of the Patriot movement, said very patriotic things that a young man in the audience, John Adams, and his cousin, Samuel Adams, were very much moved by. In fact, John Adams would write at the end of his life, it was, quote, then and there, in that courtroom in Boston, that the child revolution was born. So are we indigenous to the land? Of course not. Have we been here for thousands of years? No, we haven't. But are we legitimate sovereigns over our borders? Of course we are. Third prong. Do we have a document? Well, we have one of the greatest documents of all time. Not as great as the Bible. Maybe second best. The Declaration of Independence. But it was written by Thomas Jefferson, and it was edited by the 5 members of the Committee on Style: Jefferson, Adams, Franklin, Livingston, and anyone from New Haven? Roger Sherman. He was mayor of New Haven like 12 times. He was like the Bibi Netanyahu of New Haven, Connecticut. Who are they? They're all patriots. They're all Americans. They're all revolutionaries. We don't have a treaty with another country recognizing our right to exist until Ben Franklin negotiates one with France several years later. But are we legitimate sovereigns over our lone land? No one would suggest that if 4,000 Mexican nationals crossed over the border into San Diego tomorrow morning and slaughtered, to Pastor Hagee's point, 42,000 citizens of La Jolla, California, and took several thousand of them hostage and held them in holes for hundreds of days beneath the land in Tijuana, that somehow that would be okay because we weren't indigenous to the land and we didn't have a document. No one would say that. That would be absurd. And yet that's what people say on October 8th at places like Yale and Harvard about Israel. So let's look at the 3 prongs. First prong, they have won the land in war after war after war. 48, invaded by 5 Arab armies. 56, when Gamal Abdel Nasser closes the Suez Canal. 67, against 3 Arab armies. 73, invaded by 6 foreign armies on the holiest day of the year, and still they won. Not wars of offense, existential wars of survival. They have won and fought for, bled on the land, defended the land with their sons and daughters, unquestionably legitimate of their borders. Second prong, we've already established. The Jews haven't been there for 50 years, or 100 years, or 400 years. We're the indigenous people of the land. We've been there for thousands of years. Third prong, the Jews don't just have a Declaration of Independence. They do have that. There is an Israeli Declaration of Independence. By the way, signed by 2 women, one of whom, Golda Meirson, would later become prime minister as Golda Meir. But they have an international decree voted on by the combined nations of the world in General Assembly, 33-13 in 1947. And then after the war was fought in 49, the Supreme Court, the United States said, go back to the United Nations and get it ratified. Make sure everyone's cool with the results of the war. Now, we judges, we don't like motions for reconsideration, okay? We ruled, and that's the end. And the Israelis didn't like motions for reconsideration. Abba Eban said, don't send me back there. But they went back and got it ratified by an even bigger margin in 1949, 37-12. Is it legitimate? It's unquestionably legitimate under the law. And yet we're called aberrational settlers in our own land. Ask yourselves, why? The third big lie, and the last big lie I want to talk to you about tonight, is the same lie they've been telling about Jews for thousands of years. In the Middle Ages, it was said that Jews poisoned the wells of towns. Later, during the plague, it was said that Jews were impervious to plague and were infecting their neighbors in order to steal and occupy their lands. It was said in the Renaissance that Jews would kill non-Jewish babies in order to eat their blood in the matzah we ate on Passover, the ancient blood libel. Folks, now we have a blood libel repackaged for a 21st century audience. The preposterous claim that Israel is committing genocide in Gaza. Folks, the population of Gaza has increased tenfold since 1948. This despite the claim of professors at places like Columbia and Yale that there have been several different genocides perpetrated against them. If that's true, Jews are committing the most ineffective genocide in human history. But you don't have to take my word for it. John Spencer, a major in the U.S. Army and the chair of the Urban Warfare Project at West Point, and Colonel Richard Kemp of the British Army have studied almost every urban warfare incident in world history. And they have told us that over the last 100 years, the average and acceptable limit of militant to civilian casualties in the context of urban warfare is 1 to 9. 1 militant to every 9 civilians. And that's because fighting in urban environments is hard, it is ugly, and it is tragic. We, the United States and our allies, set the gold standard in Iraq and Afghanistan. We had a militant to civilian kill ratio of 1 to 4.5, 1 to 5. And many scholars believe that no army would ever be able to meet that standard. Folks, even if you believe Hamas's preposterous numbers, which come from, as you heard earlier, the Gaza Health Ministry, and as my friend Gabe Groisman says, we've never met the minister because he's hiding in a hole, Yahya Sinwar. Even if you believe their preposterous numbers, which even the United Nations has recently and quietly cut in half, without a single apology, by the way. Israel has a militant to civilian kill ratio in Gaza of about 1 to 1, 1 to 1.5, a standard that Colonel Richard Kemp and Major John Spencer have said no army will ever be able to live up to again. And yet we are accused of genocide, having gone above and beyond our obligations under international law. Ask yourselves why. Folks, on our judges' trip to Israel, we went to Reim, the site of the music festival Massacre. And when we came off the bus, many of you have probably seen it, they've made an incredible memorial there. A mound for every young boy and girl who fell, 364 mounds. And out of each mound is a stick, I think made of wood, with a picture of the person who died there. When we came off the bus, we were overwhelmed by the shrieking sobs of a mother who lay prostrate over the mound of her son. Her family was trying to pull her off, but she would not be moved. And we started to think of ourselves, we just can't stand here. It was overwhelming. At that point, I thought I heard music. And so I started to walk over to the right. And as I made my way over to a clearing, there were about, I noticed, 50 women in a giant circle, all singing songs. And I recognized the area where they were standing because we had seen it on the 47-minute video. Towards the end of the video, an Israeli soldier comes to the Reim massacre site. And he starts shouting, "Mishu chai, Mishu chai, is anyone alive?" You see it from his body cam footage. And he comes to the rectangular bar with a low wall. And he looks over the wall. And it was like a scene from the Holocaust, only in color. Bodies splayed everywhere, burned, mutilated, all dead. That was the spot where these women had come to hold themselves arm in arm. And one of them said to me, "Please join us." So I did. And then I noticed that all the other judges were interspersing themselves along the same circle. And then we started to sing. And we sang the ancient Jewish hymn, Hatikva. And I thought to myself, what an unbelievable symbol of these people. In the spot where more innocent Jews were butchered than in any other place on earth since the camps were released in 1945, these 50 women had left whatever they were doing that day on a Thursday to get a bus and drive all the way from Tel Aviv down to the Gaza envelope to the south 2 hours away. And they came to sing not of vengeance or vindictiveness or hatred, but of hope, because that's what tikva means. It means hope. Hope for each other, hope for the land, hope for the country for which they and their ancestors had fought and bled for 2,000 years. A country, a people, deserving of our love, our admiration, and our support. So let me leave you with this one thought. There is this claim now that anti-Zionism isn't anti-Semitism. You've all heard it. You may even know people who say it. We don't hate Jews, they say. We just hate Zionists. Never mind that in the latest Pew poll, 85% of the world's Jews consider themselves Zionists. We don't hate Jews, they say. We just hate the Jews who live in Israel. Never mind that that's almost 50% of the world's Jews. We don't think it's okay to rape hundreds of women and their daughters. We think that's horrible. In fact, if it happens to any other people in the world, we're going to travel around the world, making sure that everyone knows how not okay we are with it. We just kind of don't care when it happens to the women and girls in the one Jewish state in the world. We don't think you should take hostages, civilian hostages, boys and girls, octogenarians and septuagenarians, including 12 infants and toddlers, and 2 who, if they are still alive, would have turned 1 year old in captivity and hold them for 300 days. We don't agree with that. That's horrible. We just kind of will look the other way and rip down the posters of the hostages if it happens to the boys and girls who live in the one Jewish state in the world. Folks, make no mistake. What is Zionism? Zionism is a pure and noble ideal. Zionism is the recognition that for 2,000 years, Jews have been agents of history. We have been acted upon. We have been played upon. We have been subjugated, humiliated, turned into the other. And Zionism is the promise that for the first time in 2,000 years, we Jews will be agents of history no longer. That for the first time in 2,000 years, we Jews will be actors in history, who will be permitted to stand up for one another, who will have a moral obligation to fight back if required with reprisals that are strong and forceful and which deter, just like any other nation in the world does. Kissinger told us that weakness is provocative. If Israel allows the gravest murder of innocent Jews, the hostage-taking, the rapes, the butchery to go unanswered, the killing of Jews in the north, the displacement of 70,000 people in the Galil, if Israel allows that to go unpunished, if Israel finishes this war before the hostages are returned and Hamas is destroyed, that weakness will be provocative for decades to come. That is the end of Israel. So when you hear people crying out for a ceasefire on October 8th and October 9th and October 10th, before a single hostage had been released, before a single troop had put his boots down in Gaza, know that what they were really saying is, you Jews go back to the firing squads of Babi Yar. You Jews go back to the camps and get in the bunkers and let us turn on the shower heads and do not object. Take it like the Jews that you are. Take it like the Jews that you have always been. So what Zionism means, what Zionism truly stands for, is that we Jews, we ain't never going back to Babi Yar. We ain't never going back. We ain't never going back to the camps. We ain't never going back to Auschwitz and Dachau and Treblinka again, because we Jews and our allies around the world, including and especially in this room, we do object. And that is the true meaning of Zionism. Thank you all very much.